Hello, boys and girls, and welcome back to the reading of Hegel's history or Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy. It is not about the phenomenology of spirit, as this little meme here indeed suggests, but it is highly recommended to have a commentary when reading the texts of Hegel. And that is not that you should search for the truth in the commentary. You should search for the truth of the book in the book itself. But it is helpful if somebody contextualizes these works because the language is incredibly difficult. And that is also the same feeling that I had when I was reading the first time Hegel. I was saying all right then, keep your secrets. So if you want to read the phenomenology of spirit, and I remember I read that for many, many hours, like one page, and I didn't understand anything, right? Then I recommend maybe Gregory Sadler to you. He has made it his task to comment on the complete phenomenology of spirit. So that may be interesting to you, though I think it's still a bit technical overall, but I mean, that's funny, right? Because once you read Hegel, you learn the 4 words that every girl will appreciate to hear when you have read Hegel. You can tell her, let's read Hegel together. Or you can explain Hegel to her. Girls really love that. And that is because it is a book that is mind-blowing. And Hegel's philosophy in general is that mind-blowing. Nevertheless, let me not lose too much time. I want to come back to the lectures on the history of philosophy. And we have read the sections before and we have discussed what philosophy is. It is the attempt to think the totality of all determined thoughts, which is the idea. Okay? And the idea is difficult to think because it cannot be determined from the outside, because if it were determined from the outside, it would have a limit. And if it had a limit, then something would be outside, so it would not be the totality of thoughts. Thus, we have to find a way of how to define this totality of thoughts, the idea from the inside. And Hegel did that by the principle of development and the principle of the concrete, which we did before. I went at length trying to explain what they are. I have some difficulties with regard to that too, of course. It's not easy philosophy. But the major idea is that human reason can make itself as an activity an object of itself, and thus actualize its own potential, which is in a sense a contradiction, but here it always has to actualize itself again, because if it stops actualizing itself, it would not be a potential anymore, because potential always has to have the drive to actualize itself, and this is already an actualization in process. And that's what he defines as life, as a kind of organic development of all the different thoughts that we can have, that of course always develop contradictions, and that's why we, by the way, also have to go on. And once we are in this process, we develop these thoughts that then stand in a relationship to each other, in a determinate relationship that we have made explicit. And yeah, once we have made that explicit, we can call that a system. And this passage today that we are going to read today, it probably challenges my relativist interpretation of Hegel for the most. So if we want to say Hegel is a relativist, then with this passage we will have the strongest problems. So let's dive right into it. Thus we see that philosophy is system in development. That's what I've just said. The history of philosophy is the same, and this is the main point to be noted and the first principle to be dealt with in this treatise on that history. So he wants to say that the history of philosophy is such a system. Now, but what are the differences? In order to make this evidence, the difference in respect to the possible modes of manifestation must first be pointed out. So let's come to the difference between a logical, pure logical system of philosophy and the real history of philosophy that we observe. That is to say, the progression of the various stages in the advance of thought may occur with a consciousness of necessity, in which case each in succession deduces itself, and this form and this determination can alone emerge. So when we have the system of thought as it is presented in the logic, we have one thought derived from another with necessity, and there's no other way, okay? And we cannot say 2 plus 2 equals 4, or, and by the way, 8 plus 4 equals 12. No, we have to show how these thoughts necessarily relate in a system of, let's say, math, and math usually operates with necessity, not with contingency, so that we go out in nature and we say, oh, have you seen these 2 mules and these 3 camels? Together they make 5. Wow, you have invented math. No, that's contingent, right? There's no necessity behind. If you want to know why triangles have 180 degrees as the sum of their inner angles, you don't go out in nature and investigate a lot of triangles and say, wow, all triangles I've found have 180 degrees. We want to derive it with necessity, and that's also the case in the logic, okay? Or else it may come about without this consciousness, as does a natural and apparently accidental process, so that while inwardly indeed the notion brings about its result consistently, this consistency is not made manifest. So we would not see the consistency, we would just see random examples, and we would not do strict science. And that is maybe what Hegel wants to say is science. Like, if we want to do science, we have to make something that is similar to the idea. Otherwise, we won't find anything. We will just find consistency. This is so in nature. In the various stages of the development of twigs, leaves, blossom, and fruit, each proceeds for itself, but the inward idea is the directing and determining force which governs the progression. So we are really focusing on the inward idea which governs and forces this kind of progression. The inner idea, when we go out in nature, is what makes everything appear, even contingently, in the way they appear. And this is the challenge for my relativism, because he technically says that what we discover in the logic is also found in nature, and it's the objective principle of nature. It's behind everything that happens in nature. And yeah, what do I respond? Well, Walter Jeschke says, if that is the case, why don't we find that in his lectures? And he has given these lectures many, many times. Why didn't he try to show that history follows this development of the notion? And he says, well, Hegel led that there because he wants to make it easy for students to follow. It's a bold claim. He may not have thought so much of revising it at this stage. My interpretation is that the system of the logic that he has presented is very powerful, and now he demonstrates that we can find it also in nature, which is a meaningful task to do, but that does not mean that nature finally has this completed form and shape of the logic. And as I, for example, argue, the logic is itself historically and rewritten again. So it may come about as a different conceptual shape at some point, a different way then also of how we reconstruct nature. And now he gives an example. This is also so with a child whose bodily powers and above all whose intellectual activities make their appearance one after the other, simply and naturally, so that those parents who form such an experience for the first time marvel whence all that is now showing itself from within comes from, for the whole of these manifestations merely have the form of a succession in time. So yeah, when we have a child developing itself, parents sometimes ask like, whoa, Where does that come from? Where does it have these ideas from, right? But it just develops from an inner idea that is working itself out to the outside, from the implicit to the explicit. And he says that is because the whole of these manifestations, merely have the form of a succession in time. So they marvel and are surprised because they cannot see the inner connection of this development. They just suddenly see in time, which is contingent and related to our intuition, not to our mind and reason, where we say, wow, wow. Because we don't observe it all the time and see all these stages with necessity developing. And sometimes a child develops slower, sometimes faster, and especially inwardly. Okay, that was not the best explanation of that example, but I think the gist of it should be clear, right? So the one kind of progression which represents the deduction of the forms, the necessity thought out and recognized of the determinations, is the business of philosophy. Okay, when we have the logic where forms are deduced, then we do philosophy. And because it is the pure idea which is in question, it is mere particularized form as nature and as mind. That representation is in the main the business of logical philosophy. So if we just deal with the pure idea, and if we want to know the idea, that of course makes itself present in nature and in the different forms of a society, of spirit, so I guess like mind should be translated as spirit, then it is also the main business of philosophy to interpret that, because it is about the idea that is behind nature and mind. Okay, again, challenge for my relativism. Is there an objective principle in nature that we can just know? Maybe we cannot know it, but we want to know the truth. And if we don't want to know the truth about nature, then we would give up the project of knowledge at all. So instead, we say, well, if I want to know the truth about nature, I have to assume that there is one principle. I cannot just say, there may be nothing behind, but I study it anyway, right? So I think this is the lesson we should take from it. But the other method, which represents the part played by the history of philosophy, shows the different stages and moments in development in time, in manner of occurrence in particular places, in particular people, or political circumstances. The complications arising thus, and in short, it shows us the empirical form. So here we have the empirical form, which all appear in the succession of time, which is kind of contingent, not necessary. So there we have indeed complications to really interpret it. This point of view is the only one worthy of science. Okay, so he says, I mean, we have to try to find the idea in it, because otherwise we wouldn't do science, right? We have to assume that. That's our guiding principle. If we don't do that pragmatically, we wouldn't do anything. From the very nature of the subject, it is inherently the true one, and through the study of this history, it will be made manifest that it actually shows and proves itself so. Okay, so we try to make the principle of our thought manifest in nature, because at the same time, it's the way nature presents itself to us, not as a mind external reality, but as a nature that we always already have been a part of already. Now, in reference to this idea, I maintain that the sequence in the system of philosophy and history is similar to the sequence in the logical deduction of the notion determinations in the idea. Again, next problematic passage, this is what he claims. History develops the same way as we develop the logical categories in the logic. Bold claim. I maintain that if the fundamental conceptions of the system appearing in the history of philosophy be entirely divested of regards their outward form, their relation to the particular and the various stages in the determination of the idea are found in the logical notion. So if we remove all contingency, we find the logical idea, which is the center part of the system in development that he discussed. Conversely, in the logical progression taken for itself, there is, so far as its principal elements are concerned, the progression of historical manifestations. But it is necessary to have these pure notions in order to know what the historical form contains. So we need the logic in order to know what the historical forms are about to really do science. It may be thought that philosophy must have another order as the stages in the idea than that in which these notions have gone forth in time. But in the main, the order is the same. This succession undoubtedly separates itself on the one hand into the sequence and time of history, and on the other into the succession in the order of ideas. But to treat more fully of this last would divert us too far from our aim. Yeah, I mean, right now we cannot explain how the logic develops. And he also just makes a promissory note that history develops according to these ideas. Okay, yeah, I don't want to comment too much on it because I want to get through the text, but I think the major idea or the problem here is clear. Is the idea really manifest in nature? Can we really know it? And is it a logical idea that we have in our mind? What do you think about Hegel's thought that the logical idea of our mind has to be found in nature? I somehow agree with it. On the other hand, I disagree if somebody takes it as an objective principle of mind external reality. But let me know in the comments what you think. I would only remark this, that what has been said reveals that the study of the history of philosophy is the study of philosophy itself, for indeed it can be nothing else. Okay, this is what we have said before. The study of the history of philosophy is because we want to know the truth. We don't just want to know historical events that are just ordered in the succession of time. Whoever studies the history of sciences such as physics and mathematics makes himself acquainted with physics and mathematics themselves. But in order to obtain a knowledge of its progress as the development of the idea in the empirical external form in which philosophy appears in history, a corresponding knowledge of the idea is absolutely essential. Just as in judging human affairs, one must have a conception of that which is right and fitting. So I think he prepares here his students that they should know the logical categories in order to study history, which may be a problem that people sometimes just study it randomly. Else, indeed, as in so many histories of philosophy, there is presented to the vision devoid of idea only a disarranged collection of opinions. Otherwise, we just study opinions if we don't consider logic. To make you acquainted with this idea and consequently to explain the manifestations is the business of the history of philosophy. And to do this is my object in undertaking to lecture on the subject, since the observer must bring with him the notion of the subject in order to see it in its phenomenal aspect, and in order to expose the object faithfully to view, we need not wonder at there being so many dull histories of philosophy in which the succession of its systems are represented simply as a number of opinions, errors, and freaks of thoughts. And that's also what I said once when I was supposed to teach history at a university, Western history. And the history book, it just said, the Romans did that, then they did that, then they did that, then they did that, then they died. It's so boring, right? I also always feel like, no, we have to find the necessity with which these historical events have developed. Otherwise, we just tell stories. Then we can also read a book, a fantasy, a fiction book, right? There are freaks of thought which indeed have been devised with a great pretension of acuteness and of mental exertion, and with everything else which can be said in admiration of what is merely formal. But considering the absence of philosophic mind in such historians as these, how should they be able to comprehend and represent the content which is reason thought? Yeah, so they don't think, right? As Heidegger sometimes says, the logical sciences don't think. It is shown from what has been said regarding the formal nature of the idea that only a history of philosophy, thus regarded as a system of development in idea, is entitled to the name of science. A collection of facts constitutes no science, as Kant would say, a mere rhapsody of ideas thrown together is not a science. And yeah, the question really is, how do we want to do science, right? It's not like picking up an opinion here, picking up an opinion there. There must be a stronger idea behind for why we do these things. Or at least we must want to find out this idea. Only thus, as a succession of phenomena established through reason and having as content just what is reason and revealing it, does this history show that it is rational. It shows that the events recorded are in reason. How should the whole of what has taken place in reason not itself be rational? That faith must surely be the more reasonable in which chance is not made ruler over human affairs, and it is the business of philosophy to recognize that however much its own manifestations may be history likewise, it is yet determined through the one idea alone. Same thought again, I'm not going to summarize that. We come to the last sentence. Through these general preliminary conceptions, the categories are now determined, the more immediate application of which to the history of philosophy we have now to consider. This application will bring before us the most significant aspects in history. Okay, that is so far our Hegel. And yeah, as I said, this is like maybe what challenges my relativist interpretation the most. So you have to decide how you want to look at it yourself. I mean, maybe you help me, like, how do you see these passages? Do you say, no, Hegel is never a relativist, that's bullshit? Or do you say, well, it makes sense to read him in that direction. It may have not been his full intention back then. But if we want to use a system, we may want to convert to such a theory that may also be an opinion a bit different from mine. Anyway, I hope that this reading of philosophy gives you more insights in dialectics, which will definitely help you in discussing historical phenomena in the future. And if you want to follow me in the future, hit the subscribe button, press the bell, discuss with me. And for the rest, I just say, live long, study more and more Hegel, and just prosper.